Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you today to the John R. and Donna S. Hall Engineering Lecture Series, today presenting The Online Revolution, Education for Everyone by Professor Daphne Koller. The School of Engineering has a 126-year-long history of contributions to the university, to the disciplines of engineering and computer science, and of course to humanity. We are engineers, we solve problems. One of the problems to which we have turned our attention is that of harnessing the power of technology to improve education for everyone. We have done this in a number of ways, including things like being the lead institution in the Vanderbilt, Northwestern, Harvard, Texas, MIT Engineering Research Center for Bioengineering Educational Technologies. We have done so through designing and implementing intelligent learning systems in the STEM domains through the Teachable Agents Group, much of which is up here, I think. And indeed, in preparing to teach massively open online courses through Coursera. And just to let you know, I'm sure you do know that there are 5 Vanderbilt courses to be offered soon in Coursera, and as of yesterday morning, there were approximately 29,000 registrants for these 5 courses. So, you know, making a few waves. I wanted to tell you just a little bit, though, about the persons for whom this lecture series is named, or are named. John Hall is a 1955 graduate of the School of Engineering, graduating magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Engineering degree. He's Vanderbilt's first academic All-American. He was a 4-year letterman in football, proving that you can do it all. After military service and a short stint with Exxon, he started with a little company called Ashland, Inc., and soon, over time, rose to become CEO and chairman of the board, retiring from there in 1997. He served on Vanderbilt's Board of Trust for many, many years, including several years as chairman. He is an extremely active person, and one of the things he's still involved in is he's chairman of the Commonwealth Fund for Kentucky Educational Television. His wife, Donna Hall, is on the National Committee for the Arts, the John F. Kennedy Performing Center. She's on the Board of Overseers of the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center, and she and her husband endowed the Donna S. Hall Chair in breast cancer. They are both involved in a number of educational activities, humanities, and conservation, and we are honored to have the opportunity to honor them. Now, to introduce our speaker today, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Doug Schmidt.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Daphne Koller, today, and let me just say a few words of introduction. When I went to college, I had the fortune of going to a liberal arts school that emphasized quality undergrad education. The classes were small, and they were taught by professors who were inspiring mainline faculty who took a great interest in taking the time to get to know me personally. When I went to graduate school, I went to a much larger state university that focused on research. The classes were taught were much larger, and they were taught by a mixture of mainline faculty, graduate students, adjunct faculty, and so on, and they often didn't prioritize the undergrad education the same way. I asked my advisor, my PhD advisor, why he and his college paid so little short shrift to undergrad education. And he smiled and patiently replied that they had so many other things to do, so much other time to spend on other activities, things like writing proposals, trying to run projects, publish papers, advise grad students, especially ones who ask pesky questions and so on. And so he said, but if you could find a way to clone me, I'd be so much more effective as a teacher. Well, 25 years later, we still haven't figured out how to clone faculty very well. But I think the talk that we'll be hearing today from Dr. Koller, who is a professor at Stanford and the co-founder of Coursera, may very well be the next best thing, namely applying digital learning tools, methods, and technologies to help accelerate and enhance the effectiveness of professors, both in the traditional environments, immersive environments like the ones here at Vanderbilt, as well as the next generation of massively open online courses. Professor Koller is particularly and uniquely qualified to talk about this for several reasons. First, she's been in the academy almost her entire life. She's a third-generation PhD, and she received her undergrad degree at the age of 17, her master's degree at the age of 18, and she got a PhD in computer science from Stanford in her mid-20s, and she's been a professor there ever since. So she's clearly intimately familiar with the academic lifestyle and the academic ecosystem. Secondly, she's also been a tremendous award-winning faculty scholar who's had lots of great research contributions, not only in computer science, in the areas of artificial intelligence and machine learning, but also in other disciplines such as healthcare and medicine. And finally, as you're about to hear, she's a very articulate and passionate advocate for the transformational benefits of the massively open online courses, both on individuals and on society. So she's also fond of quoting Plutarch, who once said, the mind is not a vessel that needs filling.
You can take my quote.
but wood that needs igniting. And so I hope that we look forward to being warmed by the sparks of imagination and insight we hear from her today.
So thank you for that truly embarrassing introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. And I'm honored to be here to give this lecture. So I'm going to tell you about the online revolution, education for everyone, and I'm going to start from the second half of that phrase, which is education for everyone. Because one of the things that we're seeing around the world today is the incredible need and hunger for education, because we've come to a position in the world where it's very difficult for a person to make a better life for themselves without having access to education. And I came back from last week. There was an Education First initiative at the United Nations, and they were talking about how they go around and they ask parents of children who live on a cup of food a day what they would most like to have, and they don't say more food or better shelter, they say better education for their children. And so I'd like to start with why education for everyone, and then talk about how online technologies might help us achieve that goal. So let me start with the need for education. In large parts of the world today, people just do not have access to education because it is simply unavailable at sufficient amounts. Their capacity just isn't there. So one particularly striking example that arose just as we were starting Coursera in January is this example from South Africa, where the system for higher education was constructed in the days of apartheid for the white minority. And as a consequence, today there just is not enough capacity in the larger state universities for the much larger population that wants and deserves a higher education. So the admissions rate for these educational institutions among the qualified applicants is about 1 in 8. And so as a consequence of that, in the University of Johannesburg in January of this year, there were a handful of slots left open from the standard admissions process. And the day before they were due to open those slots up for general admissions again, there was a line of people a mile long standing outside the gate hoping to be first to get one of those coveted slots. And so in a really tragic incident, when they opened the gates, there was a stampede, and 20 people were injured, and a woman died. She was the mother of a son, and she literally died trying to get her son a chance at a better life. Now, that's a real tragedy, and hopefully one that doesn't replicate on a regular basis, but it is emblematic of the real hunger for education that we see in very large parts of the world. Even within closer to home in the United States, education is not as easily accessible as it used to be. So here is a graph of the increase in costs of various things, consumer items, gas. You can see medical care at the top, and certainly we've heard a lot about the rising cost of medical care. What has only recently become apparent is that tuition costs are actually increasing at a rate that is about twice as fast as the cost of medical care. Now, a large part of that is due to the increasing tuitions at state universities due to the decrease in state subsidies for higher education. But still, whatever the reason, the implications are that for many people, education is becoming increasingly out of reach and unaffordable. So when we started, right after we started, or rather right after the Coursera effort became visible, Thomas Friedman wrote up about this effort in the New York Times and put it better than anyone else had done before. And he basically said the big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. The desperately necessary were the first two slides. The suddenly possible was made clear in the large Stanford online classes that came out almost exactly a year ago today. These were 3 graduate-level courses in computer science that were made open to everyone around the world for free and had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more in each of them. So to clarify what that means, one of those classes was my colleague Andrew Ng, who teaches the machine learning class at Stanford. It's one of the larger Stanford classes. It has an enrollment of 400 students every time it's offered. Now, I know you don't have classes like that here at Vanderbilt, or at least not many. At Stanford, we have quite a number of them. So 400 students. When Andrew taught his class online, he had 100,000 students. So to clarify what that means, in order for Andrew to reach that same size audience, he would have to teach a Stanford class for 250 years. So when those classes came out, I think we figured that we needed to do something with that. We realized the hunger and the impact that one could have by using technology in this way to bring education to everyone. And so that kind of launched the Coursera effort that we started out in just about in January, so about 8 months ago. And here's where we are today, before we go into all the gory details. So we now have 33 partner universities, some of the best universities in the world, Vanderbilt being among that set. We're very proud of that. Working with us to provide free education to everyone. We have seen an incredible growth in the number of students. So what you see here is a graph. The blue graph is registered students, so unique users participating. The red graph is enrollment, so course enrollments by those students. So you can see we hit 1 million users on, I think, August 9th. We're now well over 1.5 million, so 500,000 students in about 6 weeks. The course enrollments topped 5 million last week at about the same time that we hit 1.5 million students, which I think is a real indication of the power of open education around the world. And when I say around the world, I'll come back to that later, but it really is around the world. Only about 1/3 of our students are inside the United States. 2/3 are in all other countries. All other countries. I think except for North Korea. Let's see. But it's not just about numbers. I think for those of us who've taught these courses, what actually touches home is less the sheer number of students that one reaches, but the impact that one has on the lives of individual students whose lives were completely transformed by having access to this education. So here is Akash, who grew up in a small village in India and basically, for the first time, had access to this kind of education. Ryan, who couldn't go to school because his daughter was immune suppressed and he couldn't risk bringing germs into the house because of risk of infecting his daughter. And so he took our classes online. And a few months later, he wrote to us and gave us the really amazing news that baby Shannon, you can see her on the left, is doing much better. And Ryan actually got a job by taking some of these classes and demonstrating his credentials. We get stories like that every day. Last week, we heard about a student from Kazakhstan who took some of the computer science courses and put them on his LinkedIn resume and got a job at Twitter and is now applying for graduate schools in the United States by demonstrating his skills, by including the fact that he completed these courses. I got an email about a month ago from a student who lives in a war zone on the Afghan-Pakistani border. And he had to drop out of college after a year to go support his family. But he walks down to the internet cafe in his village once a week to do his homework so that he can continue his education. I mean, there's stories like that on a regular basis. And I think this is the real reason for doing this kind of thing. Let's talk a little bit about enrollment. So I'm afraid this slide is a little bit old. We have not yet included the September batch of courses, which include the Vanderbilt courses. But this gives you a sense of the distribution of the number of people that are reached in different kinds of courses. Our most popular course by far is Intro Finance with 130,000 students enrolled. But then you see a very significant set of enrollments across the entire range of disciplines. And I'll come back to the range of disciplines a little bit later. So for example, world history is a clear-cut humanities course that has really no job implications to speak of. That is, you're not going to get a better job by taking a world history class from Princeton, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. But that class has 70,000 students enrolled in it. The Think Again, How to Reason and Argue is a philosophy class. And it has a similar, I think it's in one of our newer classes, it only came out in July and already has close to 50,000 students. So people are excited about taking courses across the range of human intellectual endeavor, which I think is really exciting and incredible. Okay, so what made these courses have such high impact? Because after all, online course content has been around for a very long time. MIT had a seminal role by putting out the OpenCourseWare stuff back in 2001. So what made this different? What made this difference is that it took in an online form something that looked and felt to students like a real college class. So what does that mean? It means the class begins on a given day. And then on a week-by-week basis, there is content that comes out and homeworks that go with it. And this is real homework. That is, it's not something that you can do or not do. If you don't do it, you don't get a grade. And the homework is graded, not by TAs, we'll come back to that, but it's graded so students get feedback on their work. And so it's a meaningful course experience. And you can see that people take this seriously, because what you're about to see is the usage statistics of our website. You see those little bumps that look like a heartbeat? Those are deadlines. Which basically shows that procrastination is pretty much a universal phenomenon. Now, the other aspect of a real course is that at the end, the students get something. They get the certificate. And currently, it's just a PDF email signed by the instructor. But that certificate is a meaningful sign of accomplishment of the students. And we know, I've told you the Twitter story, the students use it to get better jobs and to make a better life for themselves. And so this is a meaningful sign of accomplishment. The other aspect of this semi-synchronous model, where content comes out week by week and you have weekly deadlines, is that there's a cohort of students going through the class at the same time, which generates a real sense of community, which is another aspect that I'll come to in a few minutes. So let me talk a little bit about the components of the different kinds of components that go into this. So the first is that we're using video as a primary mode of instruction. And that has some significant implications, because when you use video and the courses are designed for a video platform, you can break away from the constraints that are imposed on us by in-classroom teaching. 90-minute lectures, everybody goes at the same pace. You can really start giving people flexibility in multiple different ways. So first, let me show you just what the experience looks like.
The game, and generally we'll start with some set of players as an accepted
Move to 1.5 speed if you're
and
bored.
then we have to decide what are their strategies. So what
English
are the possible
subtitles.
actions the player can take? Is passive and active enough of a distinction in order to really capture the details of what's going on in a predator-prey relationship? Well, probably not.
Subtitles in multiple languages. This allows students to watch at their own pace. So if they're getting it, they can watch quickly. If they suddenly stop getting it, they can rewind and watch again. Subtitles help watch quickly. It's actually a lot easier to watch at 1.5x with subtitles, but more importantly, subtitles are critical for people with hearing disabilities, people with learning disabilities, foreign language speakers. The subtitles in different languages are actually crowdsourced. These are students in the class who want to give something back, and they just volunteer to translate the content. And each of our videos is translated into somewhere between 5 and 12 languages, depending on the community of students who are taking that class. Okay. The other aspect of personalization of the learning is that you no longer are wedded to the 90-minute or 60-minute block that is forced on us by the constraints of classroom scheduling. That is, you can break up the content into modules that make more sense relative to the content itself. And so we have found that it's much better to break up the material into much shorter blocks. 8 to 12 seems about right. That's where students seem to favor. Shorter than that is a little choppy. Longer than that, people start to lose attention span. And so, and then you can start having students traverse those in a way that suits their learning styles. And the nice thing is that you can also now add more flexibility into the curriculum. So some students might benefit from background preparatory material that other students don't need. Some students might want to go into depth into certain areas that are not necessarily of interest to everyone, I mean. And so one of the, sorry. And so one of the things that is really nice about this is that it allows us to break away from the one-size-fits-all model of education that's been forced on us by having to shove 200 people in the classroom and teach them all at once. However, video is not the end. It's not even the most interesting part of the story. The much more interesting part of the story is the interactivity between the students and the material, and the interactivity between the students and each other. And so one of the things that we kept in mind as we were designing this is that interaction needs to be constant and extensive and deep. And there's plenty of studies that demonstrate the importance of this. This is from a paper that appeared in Science last year, one of a long series of papers on this topic that shows that even simple retrieval of concepts that were learned, just memory tests, considerably improved performance in every kind of testing down the line, whether it's a comprehension test or a retrieval test, more so than studying, repeated studying, concept mapping, and a whole bunch of other educational interventions. And so how do you build in retrieval into the platform? So the first is that even the video itself is interactive. So the video is not you sit there for 12 minutes just watching. It's broken down, and the video pauses every few minutes, and you're asked a question. So this is what it might look like.
These four things: prospect theory, hyperbolic discounting, status quo bias, base rate bias, they're all well documented. So they're all well documented deviations from rational behavior.
So the video pauses when you hit that yellow notch. The student gets asked a question. They submit the answer. Weren't paying attention. Get to try again. And this time they got the right answer, and there's an optional explanation. We currently suggest this about every 4 minutes in the video because it really increases both retention, engagement, as well as comprehension. Students really get sort of a kick out of, oh yes, I got it, I have the right answer. And so it keeps them kind of motivated and going, and it's really important in this kind of format. Now, this is the kind of question that I, as an instructor, might ask when I was teaching, if I'm teaching a class. These are simple questions that take 10, 15 seconds to answer. But when I ask it in class, 80% of the audience is still scribbling the last thing I said. There's the bunch in the back row on Facebook. And then there's the smarty pants in the front row who basically blurts out the answer before anyone else has really had a chance to even notice that a question had been asked. And here, every student has to engage with the question, and that makes for a much better learning experience. Okay. Now, of course, this is not about those simple retrieval questions. You need much deeper engagement and assessments in order to have a meaningful learning experience. And so what are the kinds of meaningful assessments that one can grade for 150,000 students without having 10,000 TAs? So obviously, you can do different kinds of multiple choice. That's pretty generic. Numerical answers of different types. Short answers. You saw an example in the video that I just showed. And then there's the more interesting ones that I'll talk about one slide each. Grading of math, grading of programming and modeling assignments, and peer assessment for the kind of open-ended critical thinking style work that is so essential in so many disciplines. Humanities and social sciences coming maybe most obviously to mind, but also many other disciplines as well. So let me talk first about programming and modeling. So programming assignments, for those of you who are computer scientists in the audience, we can do programming assignments in pretty much any language. These are ones that we've worked with, but there's others. You can do correctness grading. That is, you can grade a student's program relative to the question of whether they achieve the same result as an instructor program. But you can also do more than that. You can do advanced assessments, such as performance-based assessment. So for example, the Connect action recognition is a programming assignment for my own class, where the students are supposed to look at 3D sensor map data from the Connect sensor and basically try and figure out what the user is actually doing. Are they waving? Are they punching? Are they all sorts of other activities? And they're graded based on performance. How many activities did they recognize correctly? Not that they replicate whatever program the TAs put together. And we actually had students who performed considerably better than the TAs did in terms of this task. They spent a lot of time on it. But for those of you who are not computer scientists, programming really transcends computer science, at least as far as this is concerned. Because a program can be a little R program or a little MATLAB program that models an electrical circuit or a physical system of some kind. And so you can test students on their ability to correctly capture the behavior of the system, for example. You can also do the same with something like an Excel spreadsheet, which is also a fixed format output. So you can grade a data analysis task in a biomedical spreadsheet, for example, or a financial model in a business class. And so all of these can be auto-graded, and you can give grades not just on, do you correctly capture the right answer, but also on different kinds of wrong answers and so on. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So here's an example of a programming assignment. This is from Stanford's Computer Science 101 course. The students are supposed to color correct this image. This is actually JavaScript, so it's graded in the browser. And you can see that the student tried it. It didn't quite work. So now they try it again. They press run. And this time they're told that the output is correct, which means they've correctly completed this assignment and can move on. And the student gets immediate feedback telling them that their assignment is right or wrong. And they can also get more targeted feedback, as I'll show in a little bit. Math expressions. Math is ubiquitous in engineering, science, and obviously in math. And so we put in a fair bit of support for grading of math expressions. And specifically, we tried to make it so that transformations on the math expression that didn't make any difference to its semantic content didn't grade people down. So you didn't have to write down the expression in a particular way. So you can see here is one example. So the question is, what is the derivative of this function? Here is the answer. And when the student clicks preview, they get this formatted expression that shows them that the system correctly understood the expression they were trying to submit, and then they're given an answer telling whether they're right or wrong. But the system recognizes variations. So for example, here's one where the student chose to write, instead of x squared, they wrote 0.5 times x, and the system recognized that this is the same as 0.5 times x squared, and again, the student is graded, and in this case, told that their answer is right. And it does a lot of the basic transformations correctly. So not just commutativity and associativity and x times x is x squared, but a lot of transformations, because in addition to looking at syntactic transformations, it also checks for semantic equivalence between the two expressions, and we can talk more about that later. Okay, so this is great for a lot of disciplines and covers interesting grading for a large range of courses. But when we went and talked to some of our colleagues in the humanities and the social sciences, math doesn't do it for them, program is not so relevant, which basically leaves them with multiple choice. And go explain to a poetry professor that they need to grade their class using multiple choice. Doesn't work. And so that's when we, in the spring, decided that we really needed to grade more open-ended work, and the way we did that is using a peer assessment pipeline. So here we basically relied on work that had been going on in the education community for a number of years, using peer assessment in the context of small classes, 20 or 30 students. And this is a really nice paper by Sadler and Good from 2006 that demonstrates the efficacy of peer grading. And so what you see on the x-axis is the teacher grade, on the y-axis is the student grade, in this case being the peer grades. And you can see that there's a very nice correlation between those two. What's even more interesting is that self-grades, where students were asked to critically assess their own work relative to a grading rubric, is actually perhaps even better correlated with the instructor grade. So that was great, but not everything that works in a class of size 20 with intensive instructor supervision necessarily works in a class of size 50,000 without intensive instructor supervision. And so that's where we had to try things out. And admittedly, the results are not quite as good as this, but they are good enough that I think one can build up from there and achieve some pretty nice results. So we built up a peer grading pipeline that incorporated ideas from calibrated peer review, which is an idea that was generated again in the education community, but putting in ideas from crowdsourcing, which is the kind of technology that underlies Wikipedia, which is how to use the wisdom of the crowds to get better results than you might get from a single untrained individual. So let me take you through the peer grading pipeline very quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. So here is the submission phase. Students submit their work at the submission deadline, which happens here. And then there is a calibration phase. What does the calibration phase do? The students are provided with a grading rubric, which has to be carefully constructed by the instructor. So there is some thoughtful work that needs to be done there, and we're working on how to construct grading rubrics. And then the students are trained in the use of that rubric. What does that mean? It means that they're provided work that the instructor had previously graded, but they're not told what the instructor's grades are. And they're supposed to grade the work, and the system automatically compares their grades to the instructor grades, and they're told whether they're in the right ballpark or not, and if they're too high on this metric or too low on that metric. And after they do this a couple times, they demonstrate that they have capably mastered applying the rubric to other people's work, which is when they can now start peer grading the work of others. And each student is supposed to grade the work of 5 other students. I mean, you can change that, it's a parameter. But the nice thing about that is that it prevents a single bad grader from really skewing the grade of any single student. So you basically aggregate, and this is, insight that comes from crowdsourcing again. And so each student's work is graded by about 5 people. There's an optional self-grading phase, which people find beneficial for pedagogical reasons. And then basically, at the end of it, the student gets both a numerical score that we get by aggregating using a robust aggregation procedure, the 5 grades that they got, potentially including their own self-grade. And then, and I'll come back to that. And then they get both the numerical score and the qualitative feedback that they got from their peers. And the qualitative feedback is really important because it's formative feedback that tells them how, not only that they got 7 out of 10, but why they got 7 out of 10. And so people find that really valuable. Now, what's interesting about this is that people really enjoy the peer grading process. In the sociology class, we actually kept, Princeton sociology class, we actually kept the peer grading open for another 24 hours after the original deadline had passed, not because people didn't complete the peer grading, but because they wanted to grade more, because they felt it was such a valuable learning experience for them. And we've heard that consistently in our peer grading, in the forums and stuff, that people really find this to be a really valuable experience. So, how accurate is this? So we're only starting to do the analysis now. This is from the first class that launched with peer grading. This is the human-computer interaction class at Stanford, where people were grading web designs. And what you see here is things that are within 5% tolerance are the blue bars. Things that are within 10% tolerance are the red bars. Together, these account for about 58, I think, % of the total grades. So you actually get for 58% of the assignments, I think, very accurate. I mean, I think 10% is what TAs would strive for, I think, would be a good place to be. If you increase that tolerance a little bit, we get to to 25%, you get within 86% of the assignments are within that tolerance. So this is okay. It's not awesome, but it's okay. But a really, I think, encouraging aspect is this graph, which shows peer grading accuracy over time. So what you see here is in the human-computer interaction class, problem sets 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what you see here is, and each of the little bars here is a different factor in the grading. So because we break down the grading into factors, it's not just a single grade. And what you see here is that whereas assignments 2 and 3 had a very large spectrum of opinions of the peer grades around the staff grades, so 0 would be ideal, right? 0 would be that the staff grades and the peer grades are exactly the same. The more spread you have around that, the more variation we see. So for 2, 3, we have a lot of variation. 4, there is less. And 5, there is considerably less. And the reason is because we learned how to construct grading rubrics. It turns out that you can, now it could also be, there's other reasons that could underlie this. It could be that the students who stuck it to problem set 5 were better students. So that's another possible reason. Could be that they learned to grade better because they'd had more experience. There's all sorts of other factors, but I think partially it's because we learned how to construct better grading rubrics. And that's experience that we can now sort of use in designing grading rubrics for subsequent classes. And so we can now start to evaluate this as we basically learn how to do things better in this ecosystem. Okay, I'm going to skip past this. So that's it for assessments, which is an absolutely critical part of this. The second really critical part that makes this different, I think, from many other online offerings is the community. So the community really is global. At any point in time right now, we have about 7,000 students logged onto the platform. It's pretty much any hour of the day. This is North America. The little lit spots are a subsampling of students who are logged onto the platform in a given point in time. North America, Europe, Asia. 7,000 is a lot of students. It's about the number that are logged into Quora at any point in time. So this is, and this really enables a lot of the aspects of the community on the platform. Specifically, it enables this. This is our forum. It's our discussion forum. It's a place where students communicate with each other to ask questions and answer each other's questions. So you can see that students, you're not supposed to read the text, but you can see that students post questions, and what we've adopted is what's called a Stack Overflow model. These are these rankings on the left, where students rank questions up and down, and they rank answers up and down. And so the good questions bubble to the top, as do the good answers, which means if somebody logs into the platform, they can immediately see what are the questions that are most pressing in people's minds, and then they answer them. And because you have 7,000 people logged into the platform at any point in time, you can do the calculation. We have about 20 courses running now, so it's over 300 people in any given course. Some of them are going to be looking at the Q&A forum, which means that the median response time for a question on the Q&A forum is about 22 minutes, which is not a level of service that I've ever given to my Stanford students. So, and these are good answers in many cases, really meaningful answers, and there's an incentive for doing that because people whose questions are ranked up and whose answers are ranked up get reputation points, and we have a leaderboard for reputation points. And so people who do well in answering questions or in asking good questions are kind of get visibility, and people like that. And so there's an incentive for people to participate in this. Now, in addition to students, the other thing that we have are community TAs. This is a process that we've instituted in the last few classes. It's people who have taken the class previously, sometimes in an on-campus setting. So I did this first with people who took my Stanford class. And then most recently, we've started to use people from the community who took the previous incarnation of the class, did really well, scored highly on the forum points, on the reputation points. And then we asked them, do you want to do this on a purely volunteer basis? But you can list it on your resume and stuff like that. We had about a 50% response rate of saying yes. So we reached out to 40 people, and 20 of them said yes. And they're incredibly active. If you log into my forum now, you'll see that most of the threads have a TA response associated with them. Some of them have said, we really struggled with programming assignment 5. Can we fix the write-up to make it clear to other people? I mean, it's really great. I mean, they're doing such an amazing job. And so we're going to build up this community TA system going forward as a way of engaging the community, both of students who took the class online and potentially of students at our own institutions or alumni of our own institutions, as a way of keeping them engaged as part of this broad educational effort. And then you get, again, testimonials from students who say that people keep talking about the online forum as being impersonal and cold and non-interactive. We get comments like this all the time about how students are really feeling a sense of community with other students. One student actually got a marriage proposal on our site. She'd been one of those people who really answered thousands of questions in one of our classes, and at the end of the course, somebody said, "How will I survive without you? Will you marry me?" The other aspect of community is this organic thing that emerged, which is study groups. I mean, we didn't design in study groups, but people posted on the forum the thing of, would you like to have a study group with me? I live in Kandahar, or I live in Tierra del Fuego, and do you want to meet with me? And we have study groups in, I think, 1,500 cities around the world, including Tierra del Fuego. Which, for those of you who don't know, is at the very, very, very southern tip of South America. And they meet up sometimes in person. So the 1,500 cities are physical meetups. This is the San Francisco meetup where we actually went and asked if we could take their picture. We also have virtual study groups, like the Arabic-speaking students or the Russian-speaking students, which meet virtually to discuss the material via a chat room or something. And then we have quite a number of multilingual universal study groups, which are people who are explicitly looking to connect with people from other cultures or other countries. And this is a really great way of breaking down barriers between countries, because you have people from countries that generally don't talk to each other and sometimes actually are at war with each other communicating around this educational content, and it's really cool. So that's that. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that are opened up by some of this, by this kind of effort. So one opportunity comes up from the amazing data that one can collect in this kind of platform, because we collect every single event in the platform. Every time a student pauses, rewinds the video, goes to 1.5 speed, submits a quiz, submits another answer to the same quiz, posts on the forum, reads a post on the forum, everything is recorded. So it's a level of detail that most educational studies cannot reach. The second thing that you get is a scale that is in many ways unprecedented. Most educational studies have a sample size of 20. Some of the big ones have a sample size of 200. Our courses have a sample size of 20 to 50,000, which means that things that will not pass statistical significance in most other educational studies, here the patterns are readily apparent. And that means that you can now basically turn the study of human learning into a data science, because there's now enough data to ask all sorts of questions that you could never ask before. So let me give an example, a couple of examples of that. This is a distribution of wrong student answers in one of Andrew's machine learning exercises, which happen to be pairs of numbers, which is how we can graph this on a two-dimensional plot. Each of the little x's is basically a one-off wrong answer, where a student just did something that we don't know what they did, but it's kind of a unique error. The big x's are common mistakes. So the big X at the top is a place where 2,000 students got the exact same wrong answer. Now, if you're teaching in a class of 100 students and 2 of them get the same wrong answer, you'd never pay attention. But 2,000 wrong answers, that jumps out at you. And so Andrew and his TAs looked into those assignments and understood the fallacy that these students were exhibiting, and then constructed a targeted error message so that any other student assignment that fell into that bucket would get not just the "you're wrong, please try again" response, but "you're wrong and you might want to look into this and that procedure to maybe learn something about what you got wrong." And so this starts personalizing the learning experience to some of those, to the specifics of the student's wrong answer. That's one example. Here's another example of an analysis that you can start doing, and this is, again, these are all very preliminary. We've only just started to explore the potential of this data. So if a student submits a quiz and they get it wrong, and they submit it again and it's still wrong, and eventually they get to the right answer, what's different? What made them get to the right answer after not having had the right answer? And you can ask that question now, because you can track everything they did in the middle. And so specifically, we tracked forum visits, and we can identify which forum posts are most helpful in moving you from a wrong answer to a right answer relative to forum posts that just leave you at the wrong answer. And it turns out that the forum posts that are most conducive to moving you from a wrong answer to a right answer are usually the ones that are right on. That is, the ones that tackle the specific fallacy that the students had that caused them to struggle with this particular question. And so you can use this in a variety of different ways. You can use this to give guidance to the instructor by telling them, this is maybe an explanation that you should have given as part of your video lectures, because obviously the students found it helpful. Or you can use it as guidance to the students by telling them, this forum post, I see you struggling with this. This forum post might help you in doing better. And again, this is the personalization of the learning experience. Which brings us to one of the other big opportunities, I think, of this whole framework, which is in some ways a solution to a 30-year-old problem. So renowned educational researcher Benjamin Bloom wrote a seminal paper called the 2 Sigma Problem back in 1984. The 2 Sigma Problem is based on the following analysis that Bloom did. He measured achievement score distribution. So what you see here is a histogram of achievement scores in 3 different populations. The blue graph, the one you see, are students who were taught in a traditional lecture-based classroom, about 30 students. Okay? The red graph is students who were taught in a lecture-based format, but in a mastery learning form, which means that they were not allowed to move to the next module before demonstrating mastery in the previous one. You can see the achievement scores shift to the right. The last one is the individual tutoring. These are students who were lucky enough to have a one-on-one human tutor. And you can see the curve shifts to the right yet again. So the red curve is 1 standard deviation, or sigma, better than the blue curve. And the green curve is yet another standard deviation, so 2 sigma. To clarify what that means, if you look at that achievement score graph and you pick the midpoint of that, the median point, as a performance threshold, so half the students are going to be above that threshold because you picked the median, and half are going to be below. You take that same threshold and you apply it to the green graph, the individual tutoring, 98% of the students are going to be above that point. So basically, said in a Lake Wobegon kind of way, 98% of the students would be above average. Now, that would be really cool if we could do that, but hence the title of Benjamin Bloom's paper, The 2 Sigma Problem, because we can't afford as a society to give an individual human tutor to every student. But maybe we can afford to give every student a computer, or at least a smartphone. And if we can do that, can we use technology then to move us from the blue curve to the red curve and ultimately closer to the green curve? So the nice thing is that mastery is actually quite easy to do in a computer, because the nice thing about a computer is that it really doesn't get tired of grading the same work again and again. The green curve is a little harder because it's not clear that we'll be able to use computers to get to the same level of personalized, individualized attention that you would get from a human tutor. But we've already seen elements of personalization in having students take different trajectories through the material, learn at their own pace, as well as some of the personalized feedback that they get for different kinds of wrong answers. So perhaps we won't get all the way to the green curve, but the question is, how close can we get? And I think this is one of the big opportunities to improve not just access to education, but also the quality of the education that we can provide our students. Which brings us to the following question, which I get asked every single time when I speak to people, which is, does this mean that universities are going to become defunct? So here's a quote that is typically attributed to Mark Twain, but turns out not to be for Mark Twain, which is that college is a place where a professor's lecture notes go straight to a student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either. Now, I don't actually agree with that as a characterization of college education, but I do think that it is maybe a not unreasonable characterization of a typical lecture. And that maybe, to go back to the Plutarch quote that was co-opted, which is that the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. And this, by the way, is a quote that's typically attributed to Yeats and is definitely from Plutarch. So, and so the question is, how do we ignite students' minds? And smarter people than myself have looked at this whole notion of active learning in the classroom and have done incredible studies on that. So here is a study from Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Wyman, who's at the University of British Columbia, who took a very large enrollment physics classroom. I think each of the sections had about 270 students, the case and the control. And they demonstrated improved metrics in relative between the lecture base, which is the blue, and the active learning, which is the red, in every single metric, in attendance, in engagement, and in learning as measured on a standardized test. And so this can really change learning outcomes in significant ways if instead of lecturing as much, we actually spent more time talking with our students and letting them talk with each other. So lots of things that one can do in active learning in the classroom, and I've been using this in my own classroom for about 3 years. Just-in-time teaching, where you look at the quiz results, the problem set results from the last week, which because they're auto-graded, you have access to the scores, and you can say, aha, this is what students didn't get, so I'm going to focus time on that as opposed to all the stuff that they did get. Higher level discussion of the material. How do things fit together? Real-world applications. I brought in people from industry who talked both about how this is used in practice, which is very motivating to students when they're learning academic material, but also at the same time, what are the constraints that one hits up against when the rubber meets the road? That is, what constraints do you have to respect when doing something in the real world? Interactive problem solving in small teams, a la the Carl Wyman study. We did a lot of that. And then what turned out to be the case is that students really resonate with this. So at Stanford, we've been teaching online for 30 years. Not me personally, I've got to say. But people have been teaching online for about 30 years. And I've been teaching online in my 15 years or so that I've taught at Stanford. And what happens when you televise a class, because it's televised for consumption by local industry students who can't attend class in person, is that because the on-campus students have access to the recording, usually attendance drops to about 30% of enrollment by week 3 of the quarter. And that's pretty consistent across all these online classes. In these classes, even though they were recorded, and even though I told students that I wasn't going to cover any new material because I didn't want to increase the workload relative to the video lectures, attendance steady-stated at about 60 to 70% of enrollment. So more than double what I usually get. students saw the value in coming to class for these active learning sessions. So basically, even if what you do with this content is to use it in your own on-campus teaching by flipping the classroom, there are some tremendous benefits to on-campus students. It's a lot more interactive than large lectures. The immediate feedback of these auto-graded exercises, I think, is really fundamental to mastery, as opposed to you submit your homework, you get it back graded in 2 weeks, by which point you no longer remember what the problem set was about. Individual tailoring of flow and pace. This is one that we don't often talk about, but I think is actually really important. When you teach the students of heterogeneous backgrounds, the ones who come in less well prepared are often kind of threatened in a large class to raise their hands and ask questions and say, I don't get it. And so for students, say, coming in from high schools where they didn't have as much math or science preparation, they often kind of sit in the back and don't ask questions, and they fall further and further behind. The online environment is actually a lot less threatening because no one knows if you watch the video 5 times. And if you ask questions on the forum, it's a lot safer than asking questions in front of 150 people. So we believe anecdotally this to be the case, but obviously studies need to be done to demonstrate that. Detailed analytics, we've talked about that. That improves on-campus instruction as much as anywhere else. And then, of course, the critical one, which is this time for meaningful engagement between students and faculty and between students and their peers that you get by putting active learning into the classroom. Okay, so this is my big vision slide, and I apologize for being a little sappy on you, but it kind of is sort of a summary of why this is worth doing, I think, or why, for me, this is worth doing. So what would be gained from having universal access to this kind of high-quality education? So the first is that education is the great equalizer, and that this would basically turn access to high-quality education to something that is a basic human right as opposed to a privilege, which means that anybody, no matter where they are, if they're motivated and have the skills, will be able to learn something that will make a better life for themselves and their families. The second is it would enable lifelong learning. A lot of us, maybe not those of us in this room, but a lot of other people really finish learning when they finish high school or when they finish college. And life around us is now moving far too fast. Maybe it wasn't the case 150 years ago, but right now the stuff that you learned in college is no longer something that can keep you an educated person for the next 40 years of your life. By having this high-quality education readily available, it means that anybody who wanted to learn something new, whether it's just to expand their minds or to improve their lives in some fundamental way, would have access to some of the world's best instructors teaching the world's best courses. And then finally, this really creates the opportunity for a wave of innovation, because you don't know where the next Albert Einstein or the next Steve Jobs is living. They might be living in some remote village in Africa or India. And if they don't get access to education, they'll never live up to their potential. But by giving them this access, they might end up creating some really great idea that's going to make the world a better place for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We have time for 1 or 2 questions before our reception, so who would like to kick it off?
Daphne, I wanted to ask this. Have you tried to give assessments that go beyond, say, single units? I'm thinking more of more project type of assessments where students have to think across units, and then how do you grade them? What kind of interactions are there in those situations?
So if by units you mean across multiple courses, no. If by units you mean within a single course, the HCI class was in fact 5 stages of a single project. And in my own probabilistic modeling class, we had, we had 9 programming assignments, but there were, I think, 2 sequences, or maybe I think a 2 or 3 programming assignment sequence that each built upon the other. And so you have to be a little bit careful, as you would in an on-campus class, because you don't want people who didn't get the first one to really fail on the whole sequence. So you kind of have to give people more guidance that way. But we definitely do that. It's a pedagogical design, and it's up to the instructor, is the short answer. Yeah.
I have a question regarding what's the business model?
No advertisements. Okay, so these are really two different questions. There's the business model and the scaling up issue. So the business model, obviously it remains to be tested, but we have some ideas that we are optimistic will lead to enough revenue to make this sustaining. So one that we've talked about a lot is, even though we really are committed to having the content remain free, if people want a certificate that they can then present to an employer to get a better job, then one can pay a modest amount. We're not talking about college level tuition, but we're talking about, maybe $50, something like that. And the nice thing about that is when you have 1.5 million students, even if only 10% of them elect to do this, and even at $50 a certificate, it actually adds up. Especially when the marginal cost per student is really low, which it is because of the economies of scale that we can bring to bear. A second one that we've started to explore is interacting with employers who are looking to close a skills gap, because even though there is a lot of unemployment in the world right now, at the same time there's still large numbers of jobs that are going unfilled. And we have access to a pretty remarkable population of people, because these are people who actually actively wanted to go and get themselves educated. So they're self-selected to be a really great group. And we have much more quantitative data about them than just the resume, which is what most job sites have. Not only hard skills, like how well did you do on the programming assignment, but also soft skills, like what's your reputation points on the form? Were you helpful to other students? And so employers are finding that, I think, an attractive thing in terms of searching against their database with student consent only, so opt-in, so this is not selling mailing lists. And so we think that this would be another place where employers could basically help pay for this kind of education. Now, as to how we scale, the answer is, this is an interesting challenge. We grew a lot faster than we expected. And as I keep telling people, we're now in this interesting position where if you have an outage that affects 0.1% of your students, that's 1,500 angry emails. So we kind of have to worry about building a really robust platform that is going to support all this growth. And it's an interesting challenge on the engineering side. So at the moment, we're really committed to providing the best possible support for the university content that we have. You heard my answer about growth. This is something that we really need to solidify the platform before we think about any additional directions.
You've got top-notch institutions like Vanderbilt.
Yep.
How are you attracting these institutions? What's your criteria?
Those are two different questions.
I've got two questions.
We're in the midst of an interesting sea change in institutional mindset. I mean, a year ago, when we started out, if you had gone to most of the institutions that are currently in this space, whether the ones that are working with us or the ones that aren't, most people would have, looked at you and said, online education, really? And that's changed. I think it's changed because people have realized that you could provide a really high quality educational experience at this kind of scale, and that this demonstration has highlighted to the world that technology has finally come to its place in offering quality education to people. And so at this point, I think most educational institutions have come to the realization that they need to be in this space. And there are a number of options available to institutions who want to do this, and we're one of them, and I think we're in a fortunate position of providing something that a lot of institutions find appealing, and so that's how we're making that set of connections. And as to how we select institutions, we really want to work with the very best institutions and are fortunate enough to have the opportunity to do that. Yes? So let me broaden the question to one of what kinds of courses do we think are currently largely inaccessible to this kind of format. And things that involve manipulation of physical objects are by and large more challenging to do because they're harder to evaluate in this kind of format. That said, and specifically some of the things that are more difficult are chemistry labs, biology labs, surgery. I personally wouldn't want to be operated on by a surgeon who learned online. Playing tennis, playing golf. That said, we're starting to see people pushing the boundaries. So one of our newest courses on the platform is a jazz improv class offered by the Berklee School of Music, one of the top music schools in the country, offered by a 5-time Grammy Award winner. And the way it's evaluated is via peer grading. The students videotape themselves playing a piece of improv, and other students are evaluating, or will evaluate them once the class goes live. And I think you can stretch that to other types of courses that involve manipulation of physical objects. I was talking to somebody who wants to potentially offer an architecture class in this way, and they would be building a model, and they would videotape it from different angles. And again, you could evaluate that using potentially peer grading. So I don't think this is going to get to everything. Like I said, surgery, I probably wouldn't go that far. But I think you can probably do more than you think.
We have time for one more question.
We have started to get approached about that kind of model. I would point out that most of our courses came online in July and some in September, and so that was summer. And most of the courses that are listed currently haven't even been run once. There is a bunch of courses now that are being run for the first time, a handful that are running for the second time. So I'm sure this is something that will develop over the course of the coming academic year as people start to evaluate the content that are out there and saying, wow, I would love to be able to offer this course to my students. I currently can't do that because I don't have the teaching staff that can support that. That said, I want to go back to the premise of your question about less selective schools. I think this is a tremendous resource for any school. I personally would love to have access to some content from world-leading experts in disciplines that I think could enhance my class, and I would do a much better job as a teacher if instead of trying to teach this material by trying to understand all the subtleties and explaining it to my students, I could have the expert convey that. And then I would go and put it into context and talk about some of the issues and how it relates to other things that we've studied and so on and so forth. So I would actually argue with the notion that this should be the purview of less selective institutions.
I agree. I only meant it from the standpoint of the particular financial constraints that a lot of the less selective institutions are really struggling with right now with all the Pell Grant restrictions. And
Yep.
this could be an interesting solution, or partial solution.
I totally agree, and there was an article in, I think the Chronicle of Higher Ed just the last couple days that talked about the decrease in capacity in state funding in a lot of the large state community college systems and state systems in general. California was one of the hardest hit at 30% budget cuts. As a consequence, they are closing sections right and left in the California community college system to the point that whereas you used to be able to complete a degree in 4 years and then in 6 years, now we're talking about people not being able to complete in 8 years because you just can't get into the courses that you need, and people are lining up at 5 o'clock in the morning to try and be there so they can register for those courses. I think this is a way of increasing capacity at a lot of these institutions, while at the same time also broadening their curriculum to things that they might not currently be able to offer. So I think it is a real way of improving the quality of education across the spectrum of institutions.
I'd like to ask you all to please join me again in thanking Daphne so much.
Thank you.
Oh, a little gift for you.
Wow, thank you. Should I open it now?